Welcome to video 2, where we're going to dive into the very basics of Adobe InDesign. So the first time you open Adobe InDesign, you might not see this history. It might show you a suggestions panel that looks something like this. Most of these presets are not entirely useful. They sort of would indicate that you would use InDesign for doing things like designing a web page or things like that, which we really don't. Adobe InDesign is not really good for that. You could, but Adobe InDesign is very much a print layout tool. It is designed for print publications, graphic, business cards, stationery packages, brochures, menus. That's what Adobe InDesign really sings at. It's what you should stick with. If you're going to do other types of design, consider Adobe Illustrator or even tools that aren't Adobe, but we're going to focus on print design. So you might see no recent things, but you're going to go create a new document, just as basic getting started. Okay. For whatever reason, I forget why my Adobe InDesign is defaulting to picas right now. Kind of annoying, but whatever. We're pretty much working either in inches or centimeters, you know, the metric system. I kind of like the metric system, but our standard page sizes are not based on metric. So you're going to get these weird 21.59 centimeters if you're doing an 8.5 by 11 page. So let's just stick with inches. Okay, orientation, landscape or portrait, pretty straightforward. And then facing pages. Most of the time, if we're going to do a magazine or a brochure or whatever, most of the time facing pages, not always. Sometimes we're just folding up a sheet, but your average kind of gate, you know, saddle stitched or gate folded printed document is going to have facing pages. So we're going to check that out there. And you want to give yourself a couple of pages to work with. So that's fine. 4 pages, start with 1. Okay, we're then going to go down and take a look at our margins. I'm going to leave these at 0. You know, a lot of times I sort of know what my grid's going to be like and I can set my margins, but I haven't designed my grid yet. So I'm going to leave them at 0 because I want to design my grid, and my margin is part of my grid plan. Bleed, this is the area outside bleed and slug. Okay, bleed is really all we really care about. It might not be expanded in your view, but expand it. If stuff's going to go right to the edge of your page, you need to define a bleed area. Typically, we don't need to make a huge bleed area like this. We just need it to be about 1/4 inch at the most. Okay, so 0.25 inches, and we're gonna, so that's 1/4 inch. You could get down to 1/8. That's probably even enough, but 1/4 inch is really standard. Your slug area, that's the place between your spreads. I wouldn't worry about that too much. We're not going to use that very commonly, but in certain cases, slightly more advanced setups, you do need to set that. But I'm just going to leave it at 0 for now. And that's pretty much all we really need to do. Everything else, we can change all this in page setup later. So we're just creating a new document, and I'm going to not have this 0.35, 25. Accidentally click the arrow. 1/4 inch, good enough. So create. So what are we looking at here now that we've created a new document? You're not going to necessarily see this exact workspace. This is a little bit customized based on what I like to use all the time. You can customize your panel groupings and stuff like that. You can have your menu bar on the right-hand side. Totally depends on the screen size you're working on, whatever. But this is what I like to use. This is called, if you go to View, you can, Window and then Workspace. You know, I've kind of made a preset called Online Zoom, which just kind of cleans up all my palettes. But really just Advanced. If you use the Advanced view, it's going to bring up this toolbar at the top, which is probably the more important thing because it shows you your coordinates, rotation. These are the pretty useful shortcuts that you're going to use quite a bit when you're coming up with new styles and stuff like that. But, you know, we'll get into using those more. Down the left, you got your toolbar, which is selection tools and objects and whatever. Cover that more in more advanced stuff. But at the real start, what are we doing? We want to look at our pages. So if you don't see this pages palette, it's all available under your Windows pages. Okay. So you make sure that that's open. This red bar, this red box that we see, that is the definition of the bleed area. And then this white area, that is the trim, the page size, the 8.5 by 11 document. That's the representation of the piece of paper. So when I did facing pages, you know, what are we looking at over here in the pages? palette. This is a representation of, you can kind of make this bigger. This is a representation of a single sheet of paper folded in half, a single 11 by 17 sheet or a tabloid sheet, which folds in half to form an 8.5 by 11 trim or folded. So a lot of times if we're working on a magazine or whatever, it's probably not going to be 8.5 by 11, but it is going to be saddle stitch or folded in the middle. So one piece of paper, 4 pages, right? Front page, inside front page, page 2, other side, inside front page, page 3, back of that, page 4. Most magazines, books, whatever, they're just a stack of page sets or leaf sets sometimes as they're called. So we want to make sure that when we're designing for saddle stitch print that we have page counts that are always a multiple of 4 because you're always folding a piece of paper in half. So for a magazine, that's what we're looking at. So this is what these pages represent, but the spine is, the fold is always in there. And when we look at 2 pages side by side like this, we call that a spread. So that's a basic document layout like that. You can navigate around between them by double clicking, and you can kind of work around your layout that way. Okay, so starting at the cover, that's the beginning of the section with this little arrow here. You can drag down more spreads all you like, or you can delete pages or all you like. You can change page sizes and stuff through here, but for the most part, really what we're using the Pages Manager for is just managing our page count and keeping our sections in order. You can you can have hundreds of pages, hundreds of spreads in an InDesign document, but I wouldn't recommend doing anything more than a single section. If you've got a magazine, annual report, whatever, each section should be its own Adobe InDesign file. The only reason we would ever want something in one file is that if the layout is very specific to the spread and you want to be able to actually see it. Because if you combine more than one Adobe InDesign file into an InDesign book, you're not going to see the next preceding page in this document because it's going to be part of the next spread. So if you want to be able to see that, if you've got design elements that cross over between the two of them, that's why you would put that page in this one document. But we'll get into pagination and stuff a little more down the road. So we've got our basics. What is InDesign all about? It's really about laying things out in what are called objects. And essentially you've got text objects or graphic objects or unassigned objects. So we're putting our typography into type objects, and we're putting our pictures and graphics into graphic objects. That's pretty much it. InDesign is not complicated. It's not a drawing tool like Adobe Illustrator, even though you do have a pen tool and you can actually draw pretty complex Bezier shapes and things. It's not really the intended tool of that. It's real basic that way. If you want to do any kind of funky shapes and stuff, you're better to draw that in Illustrator and link it into your Adobe InDesign file. InDesign is really about grid layout. It's very much steeped in traditional grid-based typographic layout, and it's really great for that. But it has a lot of flexibility. You can do a lot of creative things, run shape, funky text shapes or whatever. But most of the time, we're kind of working with the basics. So how does that look? Let's just make ourselves a text block. Okay, so that's a text object. And let's just bring ourselves a unassigned graphic object. So I grab that tool, you just drag it, that's a block. So when you see, when you see this X here, it means that you can place images into it. So let me go and grab that example logo from my project. But first thing I'm going to do is I want to save my file, okay, because it's untitled here. So before I get into anything, I'm just going to do save. It's going to ask me, where do I want to save it? Well, in my concept development folder, I'm going to call it sample document, and we'll call this Rev1 because this is new, right? Fixing a few things. Okay, so I've saved it. So now I go and I go Control D. This will use a selection arrow here. Just kind of like Adobe Illustrator, you kind of have a selection tool and a direct selection tool, although they behave much more similarly in InDesign. But I'm going to go grab and place a picture. And let's go back to, should probably make a shortcut to this, but. So let's put my latest logo in there. So you'll notice that I'm using the PDF extension for Adobe Illustrator, so that's very common. That's going to place that in there at size. Okay, so 100%, that's what this is all about. So you notice it's kind of cropped, right? So when you have a graphic object, it crops the graphic, depending on how you fit it to the box, but by default, it's just going to bring it in like this. Okay, so it's like a framing crop area, and then you can apply color to it. And depending on the transparency setting of the placed graphic, it's going to show through. So this object has its own properties, such as location, which you can see in the X and the Y location, how wide it is, and its rotation, things like this. You can rotate stuff within your object. Okay, so that's a graphic object. Just the same here as a text. I'm just going to put some text in here. Right click, fill placeholder text. That's what a text object does. And very similarly, you can do all the things with a graphic object you can do with a text object. And these two things are essentially the fundamental elements that we use in a page layout. There's a lot of other things that we'll get into in a little more detail, but just understanding your text object and your graphic object and how you manage those things and move them around. If you want to move something around inside your text object or your graphic object, that's what the direct selection tool is for. So you notice that when I hover over a graphic object that's got a placed or linked graphic in it, change to a hand, I can drag this around inside that crop area. So it's kind of like a clipping mask in Adobe Illustrator, sort of. But you're like, well, I would like that logo to just fit within that block. I don't want to have to manually screw with it. So that's what these auto fit things are all about. So fill frame proportionately, that's pretty common, or fit content proportionately. So what that does, it just snaps the logo based on the artboard, okay, which is this area here. That's what it's bringing in Adobe InDesign, is it's treating the artboard size as the box fit. Okay, and let's say I want to have this, say I want to resize this, but I don't want to be cropping it. I always want it to just follow the size of this block. If I click auto fit, that is now going to kind of stick that logo to this size. So it's kind of like an object that's now linked to an external file that I can kind of work with a little more freely and scale without worrying about it moving around wrong. As well, you're going to see this little focus icon here. That is where the selection tool and the direct selection tool kind of cross over. So it can be kind of confusing initially if you're new to Illustrator and you're like, well, if I click here, it moves this thing around. But if I click here, oh, what's going on? So that is sort of like a shortcut so that you can quickly use the direct selection tool with a placed element without having to change the arrow. I don't know. Is it handy? Yeah, I think so. But I don't tend to rely too much on that. I tend to rely on auto-fitting, and that's more what I'm concerned about. I just want my bounding boxes to keep my shapes consistent depending on how I'm working with them. And it's pretty rare that I would place a graphic with a background color. It's not unheard of, but pretty uncommon. Most of the time you got the fill of none. You just got a linked photo or logo, and you want it to work seamlessly with whatever other graphic elements are on the page in InDesign. So those are your kind of very two basic tools, is type blocks, graphic blocks. There's lots of little different things you can do over here in terms of managing gaps and page tool management and all the rest of it, but you'll get into those as you practice with it. I just want you guys to understand the real fundamental basic setups, managing your pages, managing your objects on the pages. We're going to get into typographic basic settings in the next video, but as you can see, this is just the very, very beginnings of putting something together and linking in JPEGs and what have you. We'll get into file sizes, color swatches, Pantones, all that kind of stuff. But my next video is actually going to be just more about basic typesetting. We're going to focus in just on type, and then we're going to go into these style panels that you see here, paragraph styles and character styles. So that's the next video, video 3.